Colonel Potter, sir. My last wish is to be buried in my mother's wedding gown.
I've seen these Dodgers for 40 years. All the tricks. Dismissed.
The real reason why these actors left MASH introduction. Commentator. Despite the abruptness of his exit, he maintained a warm relationship with his former castmates, and Aldis spoke fondly of him for years afterward. When Rogers passed away in 2015, tributes from the cast reflected genuine affection rather than lingering resentment. Gary Berghoff's Radar O'Reilly was, in many ways, the emotional center of the 4077th, a young company clerk whose innocence and intuition softened the brutality surrounding him. Berghoff was the only actor to reprise his role from the original film, and he brought a depth to the character that hadn't existed on the big screen. But behind that gentle performance was an actor struggling significantly. Berghoff dealt with anxiety and personal difficulties that intensified under the grueling production schedule, and he found himself constantly separated from his young family. He later admitted that missing those early years with his daughter was something he deeply regretted. Cast members recall that Berghoff often felt underappreciated, and there were ongoing disputes over his pay and workload as he pushed for more flexibility. By season 8, the toll had become too much, and Berghoff decided to leave the show for good. Unlike Rogers, he was given a proper send-off, a 2-part farewell episode that many fans consider one of the most emotional in the entire series. Radar's departure was framed around family obligations and personal growth, and with a quiet, wordless goodbye that stood in stark contrast to the show's usual humor. After MASH, Berghoff largely stepped away from Hollywood. A short-lived spin-off didn't take off, and he eventually devoted himself to painting, wildlife conservation, and inventing, even holding patents for his own creations. He has said his decision to leave came down protecting his family and recovering from burnout, and he has lived a notably private life ever since. Major Frank Burns, played by Larry Linville, was designed as the show's comic villain, self-righteous, rule-obsessed, and endlessly petty. In the show's earlier seasons, that one-note characterization worked well as a contrast to Hawkeye and Trapper's rebellious streak. But as MASH grew more emotionally complex, Frank's character remained essentially static, and Linville, an actor with more range than his role allowed in the show, began to feel the limitations. By the end of Season 5, Linville made the decision not to renew his contract, later explaining that he felt he had taken the character as far as it could go. He wasn't fired, nor was there any major behind-the-scenes conflict driving him out. He simply recognized that the show had outgrown Frank Burns as a device. His exit allowed the writers to move away from cartoonish villainy and lean further into moral ambiguity, something many consider a turning point that helped elevate the series creatively. Frank Burns was written out with a vague off-screen promotion rather than any dramatic farewell, reflecting how peripheral the character had become to the show's evolving story. Linville continued working in television afterward, though he never landed another role as widely recognized as Frank Burns. Stepping into the villain-adjacent role after Linville's departure was David Ogden Stiers, who brought a very different energy as the pompous, cultured Charles Emerson Winchester III. Unlike Frank, Winchester was written with genuine depth from the start, arrogant and guarded, but capable of real vulnerability. Stiers played him with restraint that made even his most insufferable moments feel human. Stiers remained with the show through its final episode, choosing a graceful exit rather than a dramatic one. His final scene, quietly teaching a group of prisoners of war to appreciate classical music, is often cited as one of the series' most poignant moments. When offered a role in the spin-off that followed, he declined, feeling that Winchester's story had reached its natural conclusion. Stiers went on to a long career, including extensive voice work for animated films. In 2009, he spoke publicly about his sexuality for the first time, explaining that he had stayed private earlier in his career out of concern it could limit his opportunities, a common fear among actors at the time. He passed away in 2018, remembered as much for his professionalism and quiet dignity as for his performances. Not every story from MASH is about someone leaving. Loretta Swit, who played Major Margaret Houlihan, remained with the show for its entire 11-season run, one of only a handful of actors to appear in both the pilot and the series finale. Her character began as something of a punchline, defined by a nickname pulled straight from the original film. But Swit pushed back against that limitation, gradually shaping Margaret into a fully realized officer whose strength and vulnerability made her one of the show's most respected characters by the end. Her persistence stands as a quiet counterpoint to the many departures that shaped the series. While actor after actor walked away for reasons ranging from creative frustration to personal exhaustion, Swit's steady presence helped anchor the show through all of its transformations. MASH's 11-season journey was defined as much by who left as by who stayed. Some actors walked away chasing bigger opportunities that never quite materialized. Others left to protect their mental health or their families. A few simply felt they had told their character's story completely and were ready to move on, together. These departures forced the show to constantly reinvent itself, and in many ways, that reinvention is exactly what allowed MASH to remain compelling for over a decade. It's a reminder that even the most beloved television shows are built on real human decisions, made by real people navigating real pressures far away from the cameras. Few shows have left a mark on television quite like MASH. For 11 seasons, this unlikely blend of war drama and dark comedy captivated millions of viewers, turning a story about a mobile army surgical hospital during the Korean War into one of the most beloved sitcoms in American history. But while audiences fell in love with the doctors, nurses, and misfits of the 4077th, the reality behind the camera was far messier than anything that made it to air. Cast members came and went, some quietly, some in a blaze of controversy, and each departure changed the shape of the show forever. So what really pushed these actors to walk away from a hit series? The answers range from creative frustration to personal burnout, and a few of them might genuinely surprise you. Before MASH became appointment television, it started as a novel. Former Army surgeon Richard Hornberger, writing under the pen name Richard Hooker, published a fictionalized account of his wartime experience in 1968. The book's mix of dark humor and blunt honesty about the horrors of war made it a surprise hit, and it wasn't long before Hollywood came calling. Director Robert Altman turned the novel into a film in 1970, casting Donald Sutherland and Elliot Gould as the two lead surgeons. The movie's irreverent tone resonated deeply with a country grappling with Vietnam, and it went on to win major awards, cementing MASH as more than just a passing curiosity. 2 years later, CBS took a gamble on turning the concept into a weekly series. The show that emerged looked different from the film in some ways, more serialized, more emotionally invested in its characters, but it kept the same spirit of using comedy to process tragedy. Alan Alda took over the role of Hawkeye Pierce and quickly became the show's central figure. Early ratings were shaky enough that cancellation seemed possible, but scheduling change turned things around, and MASH soon became appointment viewing. Over its long run, the series also became known for breaking sitcom conventions, skipping the laugh track in favor of ambient sound, and pushing storylines that dealt honestly with loss, trauma, and moral compromise. That evolution, however, came at a cost. As the show grew more serious and more centered on a handful of key characters, some actors found themselves increasingly sidelined. Others simply burned out from the emotional and physical toll of production. What follows is a closer look at the real stories behind some of the show's most significant departures. Few television moments hit as hard as the final scene of the Season 3 finale, when Radar walks into the operating room to deliver devastating news about Colonel Henry Blake. It remains one of the most talked-about moments in sitcom history, and it marked the departure of McLean Stevenson, the actor who had played the lovably bumbling commanding officer since the very first episode. Stevenson's performance had earned him real acclaim, including a Golden Globe, and Henry Blake's mix of confusion and warmth made him a fan favorite. But as the series matured, more of the narrative weight shifted toward Alan Alda's Hawkeye, who was becoming increasingly involved in writing and directing. Stevenson reportedly felt his role shrinking as a result. He wanted a bigger platform for himself, telling a magazine at the time that he hoped to eventually headline his own show rather than remain part of an ensemble. When Stevenson chose not to return for a fourth season, the show's creators decided against a conventional, gentle write-off. Instead, they used his exit to make a statement about the true cost of war, killing off Henry Blake off-screen in a way that left audiences stunned. It was one of the first instances of a beloved sitcom character being killed permanently, and the reaction was intense. Some viewers praised the boldness, while others felt betrayed. Unfortunately for Stevenson, life after MASH didn't go the way he'd hoped. His own sitcom vehicles were canceled quickly, And by the early 1980s, he was candid about regretting his decision to leave, acknowledging in an interview that stepping away from the show had cost him something he never quite got back. He continued working steadily in television until his death in 1996, but he never recaptured the connection audiences had with Henry Blake. If Stevenson's exit was dramatic, Wayne Rogers' departure was almost the opposite. Rogers played Trapper John McIntyre, the wisecracking surgeon whose partnership with Hawkeye defined the show's early comedic energy. The two actors had genuine chemistry, and their banter was central to the series' identity in its first 3 seasons. Behind the scenes, though, Rogers felt he had signed on for a true ensemble show, only to watch the spotlight increasingly gravitate toward Alda's character as Alda took on more creative control. Rogers later explained that his frustration wasn't about vanity, but about watching his character stagnate while everyone around him evolved. Rather than negotiate a dramatic exit, he simply chose not to return for season 4, and because his original agreement had never been formally finalized in writing, the producers had no real recourse to hold him to the show. His sudden absence forced the writers to scramble, quietly explaining Trapper's discharge in a throwaway line rather than giving him any kind of send-off. Fans were frustrated by the lack of closure, especially coming so soon after Stevenson's dramatic exit. Mike Farrell was brought in as B.J. Honeycutt to fill the void, and the show's tone shifted towards something more grounded as a result. Rogers didn't fade away, though. He continued acting for a time before pivoting entirely into finance, eventually becoming a respected investor and media.